things off with a player that I haven't really talked a ton about this year, but he's been absolutely fantastic, and that is Derrick Henry. Now, I will say that he has cooled off some since week 7, but if you look at the first half of the season, from weeks 1 through 7, he averaged 125 rushing yards per game with a 6.51 yards per carry, 8 touchdowns, and he averaged nearly 23 PPR points per game. He was fourth in explosive run rate, fourth in yards after contact per attempt, but 36th at missed tackles forced per attempt. However, since then, weeks 8 through 13, he's only averaged 89 rushing yards per game. He has still had 5 touchdowns, and he's averaged 15.8 fantasy points per game. Now, a lot of that has to do with the game script because they have dropped some games recently, and they've been playing in a lot more trailing game scripts. And just whenever that happens, Derrick Henry's always going to get hurt by that because he's not a pass catching running back. And so he ends up, losing touches to Justice Hill in those situations. We're not going to have to worry about that, though, this week with Derrick Henry as they get a matchup against the Giants. Since week 9, they have been one of the worst defenses against running backs. They've allowed 141.6 rushing yards per game, which is the 5th most. They've allowed 8 touchdowns, 7.8% explosive run rate, which is the highest rate in the league, with also a 2.93 yards after contact, which is the worst rate in the league as well. So all that being said, I think this is an absolute smash spot for Derrick Henry this week. Yes, he's only scored more than 15 fantasy points once since week 8, but I still think that this is a great spot for Derrick Henry to get back on track. I think this is a spot where the Ravens absolutely blow the doors off the Giants, and I think Derrick Henry absolutely eats in this game. So is my number 1 running back of the week. Let's keep it moving here. We're going to move over to the Lions running backs and what will probably be the game of the week against the Buffalo Bills. When you talk about these 2 running backs this year, these 2 guys have been electric as a tandem this year. They've basically split touches right down the middle. David Montgomery's handling about 47% of the opportunities, which comes out to be about 13.8 carries, 2.4 targets, but he's 4th in red zone touches. He's averaging 16.8 PPR points per game, which makes him the RB11. He's also 3rd in yards per reception and 1st in yards per route run. Where on the other hand, you have Jahmyr Gibbs, who's handling 48% of the opportunities, 13.7 carries per game, 3 targets per game, and he's 14th in red zone touches, averaging 18.2 PPR points per game, making him the RB6. Now, he has also been a little bit more efficient with his touches. He is 1st in explosive run rate, 12th in elusive rating, 4th in yards per touch, and 10th in yards after contact per attempt is Jahmyr Gibbs. So both of these guys have pretty much gotten there on a weekly basis. They have become one of the best tandems you can get. Obviously, playing on one of the best offenses in the league. The Lions have been awesome this year. And now we get this matchup with a 54-point total against the Bills. Now, it sets up to be a much better spot for the running backs because the Bills have struggled against opposing running backs this year, as they've allowed the 12th most rushing yards, the 11th fewest rushing touchdowns. However, this is why I think this is a little bit better of a game for Jahmyr Gibbs because we do tend to see them get him more involved in the passing game. And that is exactly how you beat the Buffalo Bills, as they've allowed the 3rd most receptions, the most receiving touchdowns this season, and the 3rd most PPR points per game. So I do like this spot a little bit more for Jahmyr Gibbs. However, I think both of these guys are top 15 running back plays this week. I have Jahmyr Gibbs as a top 5 running back just because I like him a little bit more in the passing game situations, more explosive. But I still think Dave Montgomery, as we know, anytime they get down to the 1-yard line, Dave Montgomery has a chance to plunge it in. So I think both these guys are set up to be in really good spots. This is one of the best game environments of the entire weekend. This is probably the highest total we're going to see all year. Let's keep it moving here. We're going to move over to another running back that's coming off a bye, and that is Brian Robinson. Fresh off a Commanders Week 14 bye, they get a great matchup against the Saints. Brian Robinson has been a really dependable running back this year. He's been a top 24 running back in 8 of 10 games this year, while splitting touches with Austin Eckler. He's handled about 56% of the opportunities, 13.8 carries, but only 1.6 targets. He's been limited as a pass catcher with a 24% route participation and only a 6% target share. But I do think we could see a jump in touches and usage in the passing game coming off their bye. With B-Rob rested from his injuries, now I will say, though, we may see a more of a workhorse type role in the last 3 games with Austin Eckler on IR. And like I said, this was a spot the last time they played against the Titans where they really blew that team out. But he still saw a bump in terms of route participation from 24% what he's seen this year up to 31%, where he didn't really even play much in the second half. So I do think Brian Robinson is somebody that we could look at to be more involved in the passing game. If you remember last year, he was top 10 last year in yards per route run. Like, he's a good pass catcher out of the backfield. So I do expect that we're going to see him a little bit more involved in the passing game, which is only going to help him. But this is a phenomenal matchup for him against the Saints. Since week 9, they have allowed 119 rushing yards per game, 6 rushing touchdowns, which is the 11th highest rate, as well as the second lowest stuff rate, the 4th highest yards after contact per attempt, and they've allowed the 7th most PPR points to running backs this season. So I really like Brian Robinson, not to mention that Derek Carr is not going to be available in this game as he was placed on IR with a hand injury. This sets up really well for Brian Robinson. I think Brian Robinson has another big game here coming off their bye. Let's keep it moving. We're going to move over to Aaron Jones. While it's been a little bit of an up and down year for Aaron Jones, I do think this is another good spot for him against the Bears this week. On the season, he's averaging about 68% of the opportunities, averaging 15.2 carries, 3.4 targets per game. He is 7th in red zone touches this year. He's seeing about a 12% target share, which is kind of right around where you want him to be. 6th in route participation, 22nd in yards per route run, and he's 18th in fantasy points per game. It has been a little bit of a weird year for Aaron Jones. He hasn't been as involved recently in the passing game as we would like to see. He's also been dealing with some fumbling issues, which has taken him off the field. But still, I think this game sets up really well for Aaron Jones because the Bears have been absolutely horrendous against running backs recently. Since week 9, they have allowed 152 rushing yards per game, which is the 3rd highest rate in the league, 9 touchdowns, which is the most, the 5th highest explosive run rate, 3rd in the lowest stuff rate, and a 2.61 yards before contact, which is the highest rate in the league, making Aaron Jones one of the best running back plays on the week. I get it. He has been a little bit up and down recently, but I still think Aaron Jones is in a phenomenal spot this week against the Bears. So I am firing up Aaron Jones with absolute confidence. Next up is going to be Chuba Hubbard versus the Dallas Cowboys. And Chuba Hubbard is one of these spots where a lot of people have talked about zero RB and how it didn't really work this year. But Chuba Hubbard is a perfect example of a running back that definitely did work. He was definitely somebody that was a much later round pick. Not a lot of people were excited about him. And boy, were people wrong because this year he's been an absolute workhorse in this Dave Canales offense, averaging 16.5 carries, 3.3 targets, 12th in red zone touches. His 9 total touchdowns, the 10th highest among all running backs, 15.4 fantasy points per game, which is 15th, 11% target share, 14th in route participation, 15th in explosive run rating, and yards after contact per attempt. So Chuba Hubbard has been very, very good and has been somebody that has really elevated a lot of teams this year that took a shot on him. Wouldn't even be surprised if in some leagues he went undrafted and people were able to pick him up after week 1. But he's just seeing an incredible role right now, and it's only going to get better with Jonathan Brooks. Sad to see he retore his ACL. Obviously, he is done for the rest of the year, and so it just kind of reinforces the fact that he is going to be this team's absolute workhorse moving forward. And they get a really good matchup this week against the Dallas Cowboys. Since week 9, they have allowed the 11th most rushing yards, tied for the most rushing touchdowns, the 6th highest explosive run rate allowed, and the 8th highest yards before contact per attempt. So Dallas has really struggled to stop the run. This is a game environment for the Panthers that they have a shot of winning this game because, this Dallas offense isn't anything scary. So I think this game is going to be very competitive, back and forth affair, which is only going to be good news for Chuba Hubbard. So I think Hubbard has another shot here to capitalize off what he did last week. He had another really solid week after that really tough fumble he suffered against the Bucs. He bounced back in a pretty strong way against the Eagles, and one of the best run defenses in the league. Still played pretty well. So I like Chuba Hubbard a lot this week. I think this matchup sets up very nicely for Chuba Hubbard to be able to capitalize. So move over to the other side of that game because I think Rico Dowdle is also in play. Obviously, Carolina is one of the best matchups for any running back. And since taking over as this team's workhorse running back, Rico Dowdle is averaging 20 carries, 121 rushing yards, 2.5 targets, and 18.6 fantasy points per game since taking over that role. Obviously, a very small sample size, but he's thrived since handling over 70% of the rush attempts and running 60% of the routes. The only real negative has been his usage in the passing game with only a 6% target share, but which is going to make him a little bit more touchdown dependent. But this is a spot where he could definitely score a touchdown against the Panthers because since week 9, they have allowed 194.8 rushing yards per game, which is clearly the highest rate in the league. The 4th highest explosive run rate allowed, a 29.2% stuff rate, which is by far the lowest rate in the league. The 4th lowest yards before contact per attempt, and the most PPR points per game allowed to running backs this season. The Panthers have been absolutely dreadful against running backs. So this is an absolute smash spot for Rico Dowdle, especially for somebody that's handling the type of workload that he is now handling, coming off a really strong performance against the Cincinnati Bengals, where he had over 100 total yards in that game. So I really love Rico Dowdle this week. You are firing him up with absolute confidence as well. Let's move over to James Conner against the Patriots. What really stood out to me last week was his usage, though. In weeks 12 and 13, we saw his opportunities drop a little bit, only handling 63% of the snaps, 53% of the rush attempts, and 45% of the routes. Now, last week, jumped back up where he handled 74% of the snaps, 78% of the rush attempts, and 55% of the routes with an 11% target share. Now, I'm not sure if some of this had to do with the new contract, this contract extension that he signed. There was some talk that maybe we might see him a little bit more after that contract extension. I'm not sure, but if this is the type of workload we're going to continue to see from him, this is good news because the one issue we were seeing with him is that guys like Trey Benson and Amari DiMercato were stealing touches away from James Conner, which kind of lowered his ceiling a little bit. But if he continues to see that type of workload, he is an absolute smash play for the rest of the season because, as we know, the Cardinals' rest of the season schedule is phenomenal for the Arizona Cardinals, and they get a good matchup this week against the Patriots. But on the season, though, James Conner is averaging 15.5 carries, 3.3 targets. He's 13th in red zone touches. The 6 touchdowns, obviously, we would like to see that be a little higher. And like I've said, he's lost some touchdown upside to some other running backs this year, but he's still the RB17 on the season, averaging about 15 fantasy points per game. But on a per touch basis, he's been phenomenal, even at his age. 12th in explosive run rate, 9th in yards created per touch, 1st in evaded tackles, and 7th in yards per route run. James Conner has been that dude this year. He's just lost some opportunities along the way to some other running backs. But if he's going to continue to be this workhorse, and that's the new role for him, wheels up for him rest of season. And it starts with the Patriots since week 9, who have allowed the 15th most rushing yards, the 10th highest yards before contact per attempt, 13th most touchdowns, and the 12th most fantasy points per game to the running back position. So I think James Conner sets up really nicely. Another good game script type game for James Conner, where he could easily see a couple touchdowns here within this game. So really like this spot for James Conner. And then lastly, I just want to hit on Isiah Pacheco. In his second game back last week, we saw Pacheco reclaim his throne as the Chiefs' RB1. He handled almost 50% of the snaps, but he outcarried Kareem Hunt 14-5 and saw 4 targets to just 1 to Kareem Hunt. What really stood out to me was how explosive he looked off that injury, and he looks like his old self, and he gets one of the best matchups for what he does best because they have an absolutely gash this year in explosive plays. Since week 9, they have allowed the ninth most rushing yards, tied for the most rushing touchdowns, the 3rd highest explosive run rate, the 3rd highest missed tackles forced per attempt, and the 6th highest yards before contact per attempt. So this is a really spot for Isiah Pacheco. Obviously, his game is those explosive runs. I wouldn't be shocked to see him rip off an explosive run for a touchdown in this game. I think he gets back on track, scores a touchdown. That's kind of what's been missing these last 2 weeks with his return, is he hasn't found the end zone. So I do think this sets up as a really good spot for Isiah Pacheco to kind of have that big bounce back game that we've been looking for him.